Hi folks, welcome to this chapter on evaluating jobs, specifically the point method of job evaluation. And in this chapter, we're going to cover the following learning objectives. We're going to describe the steps in designing a point system of job evaluation, look at some of the pitfalls of designing that system, and also look at designing a base pay structure, including pay grades and pay ranges. So let's begin. Now, one of the things that can come out of a job evaluation system is whose job is going to be of greater value to a company. And again, we're looking, because we're assigning points to jobs, we're going to be assigning value based on number of points scored. So who would perform more? If you worked in a healthcare system and you were evaluating a nurse's job or a painter's job, some people might think that a nurse's job might score more. Well, we don't know. We'd have to put them through a job evaluation system to find out. Well, that's exactly what happened in one U.S. hospital, and what they concluded is, although we might think nurses might be more valuable to a hospital, their job evaluation system concluded that painters were probably of higher value because their job not only scored more points, but they were also paying them more. Now, in our minds, we might look at what a nurse does and what a painter does, and we might not look at those jobs as being equivalent at all. But in a job evaluation system, we're really evaluating jobs, particularly for pay equity purposes, based on 4 compensable factors: skill, effort, responsibility, and working conditions. And we assess those factors in each job in order to determine the number of points that a job will score for job evaluation. So this is the kind of thing that they would do in the United States as well. And their job evaluation system told them something different than what you and I might think. So let's look at skill and effort, for example, in a job, the nurse's or painter's job. So if we look at skill, we might look at the skill, and again, we would measure skill based maybe on experience, education, knowledge, those kinds of things. Now, we know to perform a nurse's job, it requires some medical training. In fact, now it requires a degree. Requires good interpersonal and communication skills, but a painter's job, when you look at the skills it requires, maybe it doesn't require a university degree, but it does require a certain amount of manual dexterity, focus, and an ability to mix paint. What about effort? Well, when you look at a nurse's job, it does have some physical demands, some physical effort. You have to lift patients, you have to stand or walk, and sometimes you're walking and sometimes walking very quickly from one station to another over extended periods of time. But painters also have some physical effort. They have to reach, they have to climb, they have to move ladders, they have to exercise continuous repetitive movement, those kinds of things. Now, maybe a painter doesn't need to expend as much mental effort, but a nurse does need to be continually alert. But all we're saying is that there are different skills that we're looking at. They might be different skills that a nurse needs than what a painter needs, but we still have to assess those skills when we're looking at jobs, as well as effort. They may have physical effort and some degree of mental effort and focus, and even though they might be different kinds of effort that they're each expending, those all have to be measured. Now, again, when we look at the compensable factors, I did mention that just a few minutes ago, we look for each job to measure skill, effort, responsibility, and working conditions. And we have to identify the characteristics of the job that would make up skill, effort, responsibility, and working conditions. Now, when we look at working conditions, and the other 3 factors, we have to be able to define them so we know what kinds of things we look at measuring within them. So, for example, if we were looking to measure skill across a wide variety of jobs, we would look at measuring things like the amount of education required to do the job. We would look at the amount of experience that's required in the job. We might also look at the amount of knowledge and even analytical ability that's involved in a job. Those would be measures of skill. When we're looking at measures of effort, they would be things like the amount of attention and focus you need to have in a job. Effort can also be physical. If you have a lot of heavy lifting to do, a lot of movement, repetitive motion sometimes, we would look at mental effort. We'd even have to look at the intensity that you would need to do the jobs. We'd look at responsibility. That might include accountability, might include your need for confidential data. We might even look at public contact as a level of responsibility if you have accountability to the public and you are in the public eye. And if we're looking at working conditions, we would be looking at things like, are you in dangerous working conditions? Do you have to climb ladders, work on high scaffolding? Do you have time pressures on your job? Are you subject to extreme heat, extreme cold, those kinds of things? Is it dirty working conditions? So those kinds of things would enter into it. Now, the one thing we have to do is when we're looking at things like, say, skill, and say one of the measures of skill that we're going to measure in any job is a level of education required. Well, one of the things you'll have to do is what we call scale each of these compensable factors. So we'd have to break them up into levels. So what we mean by scaling a factor is we need to look at levels of education. So if education is one of the skill factors that we're going to measure, we need to have a level. So there might be some jobs that require that require high school, that might require post-secondary college, a degree, a master's degree, a PhD, but we need to make sure that we arrange the levels in an order whereby there's some kind of hierarchy. So in our case, you can see level 2 is higher than level 1, level 3 is higher than levels 2 and 1, and so on and so forth. And then what we'd have to do there is we'd have to make sure that we weight each of these factors. So how could we decide on weighting? Well, again, what we might want to do here is if we wanted to decide how we might weight it, we might say, well, we're going to assign a certain amount of points to anybody who has or needs high school to do a job. If you need post-secondary college, we'll give you a certain number of points for that, but it would probably score more than high school. Post-secondary degree might score more than a level 2 or level 1 points assigned. So that's how we would weight it according to the number of points we would give each of these levels. So again, what we're trying to do is we're trying to recognize that as you need a higher level of, say, education, you're going to score more points. So that tells us that maybe having a university degree is more important than maybe having a high school diploma. Okay. So now, if you look at this this chart here, we've done something like this for some of the compensable factors in a particular job. Now, this could apply to any job. So if you look at here, we're looking at measuring skill by looking at education and experience. We're looking at measuring effort, looking at mental effort and physical effort. We're also looking at responsibility by looking at the importance of accuracy, maybe patient contact, those kinds of things, as well as supervisory responsibility. And then we're looking at working conditions, looking at the job hazards and the work environment. So obviously, we would have to define if these were the ratings that we had for each of these factors. Our degrees are from 1 to 8, and we're seeing education. Some people would score a 10, a 25, a 45, but we would have to define each of these degree ratings from 1 to 8 for each of these factors. These first two factors, A and B, again, we said were important in, and C are important in skill. D and E are measuring effort. So for example, if I said education is 1, I'd need to know what 1 is. Does 1 mean high school? Does 1 mean grade school? What does it mean? Does 2 mean, what does that mean? Does that mean high school, grade school? Like, what does it mean? So I'd have to define each of these degrees. And the points that I'm prepared to give for each degree is basically the weight that I'm using. So sometimes you can decide the points allocated by just saying, well, if your education falls into an 8, say an 8 is a PhD, I don't know, then you're going to get 210 points. Some people would take the weight and multiply it by the points in order to get a weighted amount. It's really up to the company to decide how they want to do that. But one of the things you'll notice, if this company is going to use this kind of a point factor system for their job evaluation, they do have skill in A, B, and C, effort in D and E, responsibility in F, G, and H, and working conditions in I and J. So all 4 compensable factors are being measured. So you just need to make sure that the degrees that you're applying to each of these compensable factor elements are clearly defined and there's no overlaps. So it's clear when you have mental skill, you can differentiate a degree 4 from a degree 5. So you know whether you should give it 80 or 100 points. These degrees should be separately defined so you know. Right? So now we've got to apply the job evaluation system. So once you go in and you evaluate all of the jobs here, all right, and they come out with a certain number of points on each of the compensable elements of each factor, you've got a total points for each job. Once you do that, you've applied the job evaluation system and you come out with a hierarchy of jobs. The hierarchy is really in 2 levels. You could look at the hierarchy as being, well, which job scores the most total points to the least total points? But you can also build your own hierarchies. When I worked in healthcare, we did have nurses and painters, by the way, and it was really a lot of fun trying to explain why some skilled trades did score more than some of our traditional jobs like nurses and lab techs. But that being aside, what we would do before we would present any job evaluation points to any groups is we would arrange our hierarchy based on the 4 compensable factors. So we would add together all of the components that made up skill. So say, for example, we were using this guy here, A, B, and C as measures for skill. We would maybe have a subdivision or a sub-add, how many points did nurses score for skill? How many points did nurses score for effort, responsibility, and working conditions? And we would do this for all jobs. We would do it for painters, lab techs, nutritionists. We would do it for physios, OTs, admitting clerks, anybody whose job we evaluated. And what we would come up with is we would come up with hierarchies and we would sort them in Excel. So we do all of our work in Excel and then we would have our staff sort them by, let's do a hierarchy based on skill. So what job scored the highest in skill? And if we had 3 or 4 elements of skill, like for example here, we have education, experience, and mental skill, we would subsort within skill. So again, Excel is a great little database to use because you could subsort within compensable factors as well. So we could see where nurses and painters were differing, where nurses and lab techs were differing, where janitorial or housekeeping staff were varying from nutritionists or painters or whoever else we were comparing them to, just to see, do these results even make sense? That maybe a nurse might score higher in education. Yeah, we get that. And a lab tech scores lower. What about a pharmacist or a pharmacy tech? In comparison to a lab tech. So, you have to kind of look at all these things and say, is the way we're evaluating and applying the job evaluation system even making sense? So we may not have any problems with respect to the way we define our degrees so that we can differentiate a degree 4 from a degree 5 when we're measuring mental skill. But the fact is, does it make sense, the number of points that we're giving them in each of these? Have we understood the job? And again, sometimes your raters might be applying some kind of unknown bias when they're even looking at the jobs. So again, the importance of having a job evaluation committee made up of multiple members to kind of counterbalance any kind of bias from your raters. But my point is, there are many ways that you can create a hierarchy of jobs before you even disclose to anybody else who's scoring more points, who's scoring less points, and coming up with your even your pay equity plan. So we can also look at testing our job evaluation system. So again, we want to make sure we're putting forth a job evaluation system that I would call fair and consistent and appropriate for our organization. So what do we mean by testing the job evaluation system? Well, the first thing we want to know, is the job evaluation system valid and reliable? And what we mean by validity is, does the job evaluation system actually measure what we want it to measure? Is it actually measuring skill, effort, responsibility, and working conditions? Sometimes it does, many times it does, but sometimes it's in its application that makes validity challenging. Sometimes raters can be subjective, okay, and sometimes that can affect how they interpret some of the degree ratings that we might give, and that might also impact how they score a job. Right? So that could also have an impact on the validity of a job evaluation system. It might be a good system, but if the raters aren't well trained or they're a little bit biased, they might not be applying the definitions for skill, effort, responsibility, and working conditions consistently, and therefore our job evaluation system may not be seen as being valid. Is the job evaluation system reliable? What reliability means is, regardless of who assesses a job, are we likely to come out with the same number or very similar number of points? So I can assess a job for an admitting clerk and you can assess a job for an admitting clerk. Would we come out with a similar number of points? If we do, chances are that job evaluation system is reliable. If we give 100 people, if we train them all equally in the job evaluation system, and most of the time it comes out similar in points, then we've understood the job, and we'd say, well, it's reliable. We would need to take a certain number of jobs from different job families across our work environment and apply the job evaluation system to make sure that it's reliable and it's valid. You've got to imagine, in a large work environment with a lot of jobs like in healthcare or education, that could take an inordinate amount of time. So the larger your organization, the longer it's going to take just to evaluate the system to make sure it's valid and reliable. If it doesn't meet both of those criteria, you can't use it. You have to make sure that it is reliable and valid. This is why I said in an earlier video, it's really important that you seriously consider buying a system that's been tested and put together by experts in this area instead of developing your own. The other thing we want to look at when we're testing a job evaluation system is, if we know our system is valid and reliable, we have to now make sure that we pick jobs, or if we believe it to be valid and reliable, to test that validity and reliability, we might want to pick some benchmark jobs. So those would be jobs where there's a good amount of data from the work environments outside of our organization that we can compare to. So some of these benchmark jobs that we might want to test the job evaluation system with might be things like jobs we can find in most organizations: HR generalists, accounting people, clerical staff, those kinds of jobs which we know. Corporate lawyers, for example, those would be good. If you're in a specialty industry like healthcare, you know that there's a lot of job data available for nurses, lab techs, surgeons, different types of groups within that. Head nurses, medical lab technicians, those kinds of things, OTs, PTs, those kinds of things. So again, sometimes benchmark jobs might vary depending on the organization or the industry that you're in. And what you'd want to do is you'd want to evaluate those benchmark jobs and then get an idea of how many points they're scoring in your system and what you're paying them. All right. What we're going to do then, or what we would do after we've got that, if we're satisfied that our job evaluation system is coming up with the right hierarchy for the jobs, we think it's valid and reliable, then what we would want to do is we would want to take the next step in testing the system, and we would say, for all of those benchmark jobs, we now have points and we know how much we pay them. Now we want to take these same jobs, go out into the marketplace, and now see if we're paying those jobs fairly. You won't find out how much another hospital or another institution that's in your industry, how many points it scores. They're probably using a very different job evaluation system than you are. But at least you'll know in your own organization how many points the job scored and what you're paying it. And then you can use that as the basis to go out and say, well, now I know what I'm paying these jobs and how many points they score. Now I got to go out into the marketplace and see what are the closest job matches I can get in my organization out in the labor market. And now I kind of want to do like a little salary survey and see how much are they paying those jobs. That's the basis upon which our third learning objective is going to be met and help us to design an actual pay system whereby we're going to be able to say, are we paying these jobs fairly? Okay, so I'm going to cut off this first video here, and what we're going to do now is we're going to get more into how we're paying those jobs once we've evaluated them and what we would look at to determine whether our pay system is fair. So we'll get back to you in the next video.